like, does everybody hear me okay? Yeah, I think so. I feel like, yeah, we need some more coffee in this session, I'm sure. So I'll try to keep it light. My name is Tim Riddle. I've been in healthcare analytics, kind of ages me, probably about 25 years now. Various roles, right? Been a developer. They didn't have at the time data scientists, so they called us analysts, but the principle was the same. But basically what I've done for the last 25 years is in every organization is tell stories with data, right? And that's what it comes down to. Sometimes it's people on death's door. One time I had the privilege of working with ventilator data. And if anybody's familiar with ventilators, that is really, really sick people. So maybe playing for keeps. Sometimes it's been to make sure that you don't have a very bad day when you break your leg and stay in the ER for 4 days, right? Did a lot of work early in my career with ED redesign, right? I'm not a clinician, not a doctor, more the process analyst behind that data, but like what causes an emergency department to have a very bad day? And if you're not really sick, to wait forever, right? So they asked me to speak, and really what I wanted to share is just our journey. And there's some good news and bad news, I think, at least in our journey. So the thing I think about any of these conferences when I go is, can I get one thing out of the presentation? That bar's pretty low, I know. But like, the hope is that you can get at least one thing you could take back and maybe try on your own for your organization. So, all right, already off to, there we go, okay. So, kind of center my talk around some of the principles that we've used over the last 4 years. Like many organizations, right, we generate a lot of data. What we found is we had very specific silos of data. So sat through American Airlines, and they had a very similar story, right? So we hear a lot of the same stuff over and over again. So what are your goals? What does success looks like? How do you get started? Some of this can be very complicated, especially with LLMs and AI, so the principles are kind of the same. How do you enable your subject matter experts? We had a lunch session earlier, and we were talking about, I don't know if anybody here has the traditional data scientist, but like in the last 2 organizations I've worked at, I've showed up. Congratulations, let's have you work with the data scientists. And do you think that was the domain expert? No, it was always, in the last 2 organizations, at least the PhD in neuroscience was our data scientist, right? So you're like, oh, that guy. Not the stereotype, but we know that guy. And that guy will drown you in weeds quicker than you can obviously ever imagine. So, how do you enable your more business users along this journey with AI? What does simple look like? How do you solve a whole problem? So earlier in my career, I was really, really poor when I went to college. And I showed up to manage restaurant chains. And the nickname I had, unfortunately, was the Hatchet Man, is what they gave it me. Because it's like I would go into failing restaurants and turn them around, figure out how to work the process. And I think a lot of analytics, we get lost on what's the drain on the process. So I'll spend some time at least talking about our journey to try to make it simpler for our domain experts to use our data. So wouldn't be a presentation if I didn't shamelessly plug my own organization. So this is Premier. What does Premier do? We have data from over half of all American hospitals. We have over 4,300 hospitals that trust us to help on their supply chain. So like we're in the thick of it with the recent hurricanes, trying to help our organizations get the right supplies. Now, I never want to take credit because it's really our organizations that do the heavy lifting. We're just an enabler. But we have about $84 billion our organization spend through our group purchasing organization, which means we act as like a contracting mechanism for them. That gives us over 100 billion data points on healthcare in America, all the way down from both bloodstream infections. If anybody's familiar with bloodstream infections, 1 out of 10 people don't come home from them, so very dire, right? So all the way up to something simpler is, should I be buying a different kind of supply? And we're decently rated. We're, of course, the best company to work for in US News. I like to think of us, if you're a Star Wars fan, and of course I'm a geek, so I am. we do blue lightsaber work, is what I would say. Not the red lightsaber work. At least we try to think we do. We try to get together and act better than the individual organization. So that'll be a lot of the rest of my talk, is how do we try to give our organization shortcuts on analytics and AI. One of my organizations told me, Tim, who do you think our number one competition for talent is? And they were out in rural America, so I had no idea. I said Walmart and McDonald's. So, it's a different hiring pool. And so what we try to do is help enable our organizations to use their people to the best, because they might not have as much people as some of the other organizations. And we want to help them deliver the best care. And so really, I kind of already covered this, but we try to use our scale, right? So organizations trust us with their data. They trust us with helping them. And we want to find shortcuts. By definition, I'm a fairly lazy guy. I don't like to do things the hard way. And that's kind of, in some ways, our principles. How do we make sure our organizations don't do things the hard way, right? Is there something we can give them a shortcut, either in the data we're providing them back, in the solutions we're providing them back, so they don't have to invent everything themselves. They're trying to take care of patients. They're not trying to invent the next piece of software. I mean, they do that sometimes, but we want to help them along that journey as much as possible. So what's really the problem in healthcare? I know not everybody's in healthcare probably in this audience, but we continue to produce a stunning and gargantuan amount of data that hasn't been used as well as it could to help people, right? Get home, stay healthy, whatever. This is an older stat, but 1.2 billion clinical documents are created. It's way more than that actually now. This is an older stat, but increases at 48% per year. It's like a compounding data problem, right? It's really hard to make sense of it. And EMR companies, there's nothing wrong with them. They'll tell you that they're going to fix everything. And it's kind of like the old days, it ages me, but Microsoft said it had something for everything, right? And Microsoft is a great company, right? But it doesn't do everything perfectly. And there are other companies, or Microsoft would just dominate the world. And so it's kind of the same thing. And we're kind of acting as an adjunct in many cases to folks' EMR and other kind of operational software, because they can't be great at everything, right? So we want to help our organizations be great where they can't. This is kind of more analytics stats. But when thinking about your own organization, right, it's pretty abysmal, our track record, and it's because it's complicated. It's not as simple as it needs to be. Generally, half of all analytics projects fail, right? It's still you go back and look at the stats, and unfortunately, they're kind of dismal. They don't change very much. They stay the same almost year after year. People quibble about this, but at least 60-80% of the analytics work still is what I'd call munging data, right? Getting it from a basic setup to where it's analytics AI ready hasn't really changed that much. And then this has been the law, at least of the universe I've seen in my career. I've recreated something very simple. How often does somebody stay in the hospital? Almost every organization I show up and it's like, where's your length of stay report? I got 17 of them, Tim. Okay, which one do you like? Well, I like this one for that, this one for this. And so a lot of what we've tried to do with the product we have that I'll talk a little bit about, but just as a holistic thing, is try to eliminate recreating the 80% of analytics that keeps getting recreated in our organization and other places. Like let's start with the standard way of doing this, because 80% of analytics are created 100% of the time in some cases. And somebody else smarter than me said that long ago. So this is a build out of that, regardless if in your healthcare or another type of industry. One thing to consider is this whole curve that you're working on when you're talking about getting data ready for AI, or just getting data ready to be used, right? You get a data, you put it into a model, you integrate it, and then you finally get to a point where you can actually use it, right? One of the things I would, coming back from this talk, I'd think about is maybe take a fresh set of eyes at your organization and some of the steps along the way. if you haven't recently. Like, how are we getting in our own way, right? I would say. And, that's what we kind of tried to do comprehensively for our organization with, I'm going to have a product I talk about, but only in passing. Because, by the way, the first thing we did to try to align incentives for this journey of ours is we said the first person that's going to eat our product is our own people, right? I mean, it's an awful phrase, but eat our own dog food. So we have a couple hundred consultants that work with our organizations to improve their performance. Like what I used to do. I was talking about ED redesign. We have those kinds of experts, right, in our organization that will parachute in. Your ER is broken. How do you fix it? And our organizations do most of the work. We just kind of guide posts and stuff. But we have people like emergency department ex-nurses, floor nurses and stuff that used to work in those places. And they'll come in and they'll say, let's look at the data together, right? Well, we'll work on it. And so what we decided was to align incentives and to get this stuff AI ready is we're going to eat our own dog food. Awful phrase, but that's what we're going to do, right? If we're going to give it to customers, if we're going to say that they can trust us with this, we better sure be doing our line work with it, right? And this is probably part of the meat of the kind of discussion where we had some journeys. So we'd failed at this a few times. We had all these different pockets of data. It's probably similar to a lot of organizations that have this, a CRM system, even if it's not a healthcare system. They got this thing over here, we tried it dramatically and failed a couple times before. So how could we start like much smaller? And that's the same thing I would say about your AI data. We were talking about that just at lunch, is even on LLMs, and text-to-SQL LLMs and stuff like that. We have first tried to put our whole data model, all 3,300 columns, under the LLM, right, and give it examples and have everything kind of going in one model. Figured out that it just doesn't work that well, at least for us. We're trying to compartmentalize stuff. Same with this. How do we have an iterative journey so it's very small? This is one-on-one analytics, admittedly, but really try to keep that in mind. Tell stories that aren't technical. So one of the things that we've done over the last few years, and we've gotten a little bit better about this, is we have a data storyteller process now. It's not something we invented. You can go online and actually Google data storytelling process. You'll come up with 90 million consultants and 14 different templates. But there was one I bought for $50, an example, right? And what we did is we started with all of our analytics. We were delivering either internal or external. What's the question? What's the answer? I'll come back to that in a second, because this also applies to getting data ready for AI. Because the bots ask the same sort of thing, guys. If you're not familiar, they want labels. Labels are a fancy word for question and answer. That's what I figured out after I kept talking to my PhD. And when we talk about labels, it's question and answer, it's SQL, right? And so that's one of the things. And then you can see at the top here, we kind of had a complex list of data constituents, right? We had folks that were our own consultants. We had folks that were data analysts, data engineers, BI visualization experts. And then we had customers that wanted to use our data as a service. They wanted to download it all, put it in their EDWs. We had customers that wanted to use this as platform as a service. And so, again, one of the things to try to unearth as you're working through this journey is what are the gotchas? Because a lot of times, if you haven't done a full surveillance of what you think people are going to use your data or kind of your platform for, what you find is you miss something along the way. And we did that a few times, but just trying to get a composite picture of where you could get stuck is helpful. And on the other side of the coin, what we just wanted to kind of bring up really quick is how do you not just use the traditional data scientists or the developers to tell that data story? It's kind of like Miley Cyrus's dad, 80% business, 20% party in the back, if you want to use that old term. How do you bring people to the forefront in using this data that are more 80% subject matter expert and 20% dangerous with technology? That's worked well for us. We founded a data storytelling team. We hired 10 people over the years, right? They weren't developers. They were nurses. They were practitioners. They were people that were interested in the data. But some of them didn't even know how to write SQL when we first started, right? And what we found, although that's not the only type of folks you need in your organization, is they would bring better questions and answers. They would bring better stories, and that was helping improve the quality of our data. And then the final thing is partnerships, right? So one of the challenges we had is we wanted to invent our own text-to-SQL, and we still do, because we're plucky and we're engineering focused and we're cool like that, right? The challenge, and this is a hard challenge, and I don't know that I have a perfect answer, is how do you rely on some partners like Teradata, like other partners in this space that have way more money and skills to invest in things than you could personally invest in? Now, there's a human element to this because in some case you're calling somebody's baby ugly, and that's challenging. But because this is a fast-moving area, like how do you, have a network of partners that are kind of that you can lean on to do this? This is the product I was talking about. I'll get to that in a second. But we've all seen these kinds of things. Well, why should you have any enterprise data warehouse? This is like 101, but like all these things are important, of course. Many of our organizations struggle to build their own enterprise data warehouses. Therefore, they rely on companies like Epic or some of the EMR companies. The problem with that, again, is they're okay, but they're not good at everything. And they're probably less good at analytics than the clinical workflow. So that leads them to have a whole host of problems. So what we decided to do, and this is both for internal and external on our journey to make our data better, was we started with kind of 4 principles. So like we wanted to build some adapters on different data domains. So this is pretty common, no matter what industry you're in, no matter what you're working. American had something similar earlier, I think. To accelerate your analytics strategy. So, your general ledger, how often people clock in and clock out, those kinds of things. We built that. Some organizations wanted to use our infrastructure because although we're not an infrastructure provider by trade, we have more expertise in that area than maybe an individual organization. Because if you think about back to the talent wars, they just can't keep DBAs and cloud infrastructure experts. So we're helping bridge that. But the 2 on the left or right, depending on your side, are probably the most important. So when you're thinking about strengthening your data, both for AI and for analytics, period, one of the shortcuts or tricks maybe you could consider is to think about it in terms of almost like a Netflix, a content library would be one thing I would think, just to part upon you guys. It worked well for us, at least. So again, back to my saying about there's 17 different length of stay reports. We have an example in Tableau with code, with the data behind it, that has that length of stay report. It's a production report that we give to our members to help them improve their length of stay and make sure that their patients come home to their families, right? But we give them the source code, and we give them that in a library, and we give our consultants that same library. And now it is like Netflix, but it's a movie you can edit, if I was smart enough to actually edit a movie, right? And so regardless of what industry you're in, I think that's one thing that I could say has worked well for us is that library. And with that library comes a community of practice, right? We have dozens of organizations on the exact same code set with the exact same library, sharing back new things that they put in the library that they'll share back to us and say, good, can we keep it? They'll tell us either yes or no. If it's, can we keep it, then we harden it. And all that process means is some of our data storytellers look for bad SQL, look for things that they might not have caught to go into production, then we put it back in our library. So that has kind of fostered a cycle recently for us of, now we have over 50 health systems on this particular community of practice. And that's a lot of folks, right? And they don't all have to build their own thing now. And our consultants take some of their ideas when they allow us to share, and they take that library and then help improve their care. So it's kind of a virtuous cycle. So regardless of what industry or how your situation is, think in terms of things that they keep reproducing or keep having to do. And I think that has been helpful for us. This kind of is just, it'll be in the slides, but what we're trying to do is basically hit the simple button for folks that don't necessarily have those data storytellers or have as big of a team to build their own EDW, right? Some of them take our data and put it in their EDW, but what we're trying to do, again, is take shortcuts. So, from a single access point, they could use our infrastructure, or they could take it and download it. I think one of the things is when you're struggling as an organization with a vast constituent of different types of personas that are hitting your data and analytics and AI and LLMs and all this other stuff, is how do you kind of meet them all where they are? And the trick we did, good or bad, is we chose transparency, simplicity, and showing our work. It doesn't work for everybody, but we show our work, right? We show our code, we show our work. And when people ask, well, couldn't they steal from you? Sure, let them try. You know how hard it is to do this? Not in a bad way, but I'd rather they steal from us and use it and learn than to go to the next provider. And so just a little more detail on that, and hopefully drawing some connections for what other folks can do. We have this kind of, what do one of my old mentors say? If it's a complex picture, you can say whatever you want. So we have data in from our organization. Sometimes they're raw clinical messages. Sometimes they're whatever. Fun fact, our organization actually makes disease outbreak software. So not too long ago, we were fairly busy. Not to take any of the credit. Of course, our organizations did all the heavy lifting during COVID, but we have real-time HL7 messages that come in and tell somebody when they had COVID, when the ventilators were out. And so we did our best to help our organizations, pulled a few all-nighters. So we have that kind of messaging. We have just like time and attendance when a nurse clocked in and clocked out. We have basically the point is we have a lot of different disparate data. And it was working pretty well for us, but it was always in silos. And through this journey for the last 4 years, we've tried to eliminate the silos. There's still silos of data, but it's all joined together. And we started that before LLMs were a thing, so we were lucky because we didn't. The main part I would say about getting data ready for AI, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, is it's the same thing as if you're getting it ready for lay humans in many cases, right? Not too long ago, we just looked at our metadata, actually like a week ago. And I tried to sit down on a calm day with a fresh cup of coffee, so could I understand my own metadata? And the answer is sort of. Like, that's pretty embarrassing, Tim. I can sort of understand my own metadata. I got metadata in every column, right? It's perfect. And we talked a little bit about this not too long ago, too. It's like, okay, well, it's good, but will the bot understand it? Because you're putting on a new lens, right? Before it'd be like the industry analyst for 20 years or whatever. And it's like, no, now the bot. And the bot knows about the same as a layperson. And so luckily we started this journey a little earlier, but it's the same journey as to get to a simplified data model, to get to a simplified set of metadata that a layperson could understand. Like for length of stay is the final, reusing that example. Like, what does that mean? It means how often do you stay in the hospital? How many days, right? And I looked at my length of stay description, and it's not bad, but it's like 4 sentences. I'm like, to say how long somebody stayed in the hospital? I mean, I think we could do better, guys. And the reason why that matters when you're thinking about how to make your data ready for AI is the bot is not, it won't infer the stuff that human beings will infer right now. It's not quite as good. It'll get you there, but it won't get you there. And so we put all this data in. We had these different things, like I talked about. And that helped us. Again, it's just a blowout of the previous slide. So a BI library with production source code is one good trick. A SQL library. A SQL library is good for AI too. We lucked out there because our SQL library is transferable to an LLM. And we didn't realize it at the time, right? We started building this like 3 or 4 years ago, but we did luck out that way. And this what fancy term they call labels, right? It's really a question and an answer. So that's definitely good. And then the final thing I would talk about here, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, is making sure you're reevaluating your data models. Sounds very basic. I'll give you a quick example. So we had an older legacy product, and it's got 20,000 users on it, so a lot of people hitting it, right? And over time, there's sprawl. So if you think about it, it's like an aggregate on top of an aggregate because the performance was bad. We're pulling MicroStrategy or whatever, guys, on this, and it's like, you look at it, and it's up to 1,200 tables. And so when you think about that from an AI and newer age perspective, how do you think the bot's going to do on 1,200 tables? And again, we lucked out because the answer is not very well. That's a lot of stuff, right? It's going to hit the context window. It's not going to do very well. So I had a trick a few years ago with some of the team, and we lucked out again on this, but I want to impart this, is we had something called a simplified data model. What does that mean? It just means a country doctor data model, guys. And so what I mean by that is there's Kimball and there's Kimball. Anybody who was trained old school on Kimball, you know, star, schema, whatever. But what we were finding when we were trying to do this from an assembly line perspective for our consultants and stuff is, in our case, it's healthcare data, so there's a disease, and it's got a code, right? And what do you think the first thing every guy and gal were going to do when they built that report? They were going to go get the description, right? But then maybe our description was in one table, then there's another description table. Pretty soon you got a 12-table join to get to the same answer, right? And so what we did was we took those 1,200 tables and we turned them into 12. And we were very mindful of that. We did some hacks. People hate it. It's not Kimball. It's not anything. It's called a simplified data model for a reason. It's simple. It's not completely overgrown, but we made some good and bad choices. And the only choice we talked about was joins are the devil in our analytics, meaning how many joins do I have to get to a question on average? And then in some cases it's Kimball, in some cases it's not Kimball. It's you know, late country doctor, eliminate the joins, right? And so I think that applies also to AI, because the bot not going to understand 1,254 tables. It's just not, guys. I mean, we've been trying to get LLMs to work right, and we're getting closer, but to help our organizations get to their opportunities faster, it's like anybody else that's using this stuff, but 12 tables it can get. 1,254 it's not, just not. I mean, maybe one day, maybe 5 years from now, it'll be like, it doesn't matter, but for us. And so the final piece to think about is, okay, great, you got all this opportunity, you fixed out your LLMs, you got your data ready for AI. But if you get the answer to your question, how are you hardwiring that to actually improve your organizations, regardless of the data domain, right? Like, in this case, I'm going to use a clinical example. So I don't know if anybody's gotten blood here, but blood they call a liquid transplant in healthcare. Not to get too technical, but why do they call that? You're putting somebody else's blood in your body, right? They do a lot of disease vectors, they do a lot of stuff, but ultimately at the end of the day, you're putting somebody else's blood into your body. And unless you're really sick, you shouldn't get that, right? I mean, yes, you should get it if you need it, but there's a simple test called hemoglobin. And they still to this day say 50% of all transfusions in America aren't needed based on a simple lab test, right? Okay, so now we have some data and we've got evidence, and you know, in this case it's healthcare and it's for keeps. You're putting blood into somebody's body and it could have a bad reaction. It's not often, but it's enough, and plus it costs $1,200 for a unit of blood because Red Cross has to get a volunteer, but they got to do all this stuff. They got to move the blood and it's got to stay in cold storage, right? So the point, even if you're not in healthcare, is how are you hardwiring the results? In this case, we have a product that will fire an alert to a clinician. Do you really need that blood? This lab trigger is greater than that blood would indicate. And it says on the back of Epic, the EMR, right, or other EMRs. And my point here is we have a retrospective analytics on one side of the coin. But if you know the answer and you haven't figured out what you're going to do with that answer as an organization, you're kind of missing the point, I guess, is the thing, right? So, okay, I know I'm overusing blood. How do I fix it? Don't know. Well, that's not good. So regardless of what it is, I think the thing to, at least what I've learned over the last 4 years, is try to have a plan. You got a question, like in the data storytelling process. You got an answer, your data's AI ready. Let's say you got a bot now that works well. It'll tell you that answer. You're overusing blood in these units, in these hospitals. Okay, now what do I do? If you don't have an answer to that, that's kind of challenging, right? So think about in your organization's process, what would you do with the answers? This isn't really for the AI talk, but just in general, right? If it's your CRM is a mess and it's not going to work on the campaign, well, what do you do with that answer if you get that answer? And so that's probably one of the final pieces, is how do you hardwire, when you get an answer, how do you hardwire the improvement in? And if it's not, this is healthcare specific, but if it wasn't, like I used to know an organization that used to work with the shopping, you know, the grocery cart answers, and it used to be like, how do you get that, right? And so here's a couple examples of that. Just wrapping up, you know, here we got one on bloodstream infection. So the answer would then fire into an alert maybe in an organization. Here was that blood example. I said, well, here's your blood utilization, how often you might be overusing it based on lay clinical terms. The doctor's always right, but like here's the evidence based from JAMA and stuff. That kind of leads you to like how do you go through the entire ecosystem and figure out to get to the end. And then finally wrapping up, kind of shared a little bit about the journey, you know, start out small, be thinking a little bit about it. There's different ways to think about it. If this makes you cringe, be thinking a little bit about it like I'm at McDonald's and I'm gonna produce hamburgers. What's gonna stop me from producing hamburgers well? Like what parts of the ecosystem are gonna take a long time? And then finally, we talked a little bit about making data AI ready. One of the final things I would share is I figured out that our metadata is good, but it's not good for the bots. And so right now, what we're doing is experimenting with different descriptions. It's the little things like that, like taking a fresh set of eyes on what you thought was decent, even if you've got things that are decent, and thinking about it from the lens of, well, how's the bot going to interpret this? It's going to be more like a lay human being and not an expert. So you got to maybe rewrite or rethink some of your metadata if it's using that in the LM. So I think that was it. Did I blow over? We have question time.
Indeed. So we have a microphone that is going to wander around the back. If you have a question, please put your hand up. But just while we're waiting for somebody to be brave enough to put their hand up, I have a brother who's a doctor, so yes. I don't get to spend that much time in the healthcare industry, but always excited when I do get to kind of, you know, play a little bit. You talked a little bit about this idea of building these community of people that have expertise, that you kind of taught them to be data people. Yeah. What were some of the tricks you used to teach subject matter experts to know our domain?
Yeah, so it's actually, it depends. So we were lucky enough to recruit for them. So, you know, and I was the hiring manager, so good or bad, what I would ask really is, like, tell me a story. And sometimes it'd be, tell me a story or your favorite story around data. Or tell me a story of, just tell me your favorite story, period. And I'd listen for certain cues. Like, okay, it's the Odyssey, let's do something weird, you know, whatever it is. And not everybody's going to want to do that process, but you could kind of hear, you know, I did this and that. So, and from there, usually it's like how I learned. So I learned on Excel, right? And then I said, well, Excel's not good enough. I have Microsoft Access, right? And it's like, well, Access is not big enough. I needed 12 Access databases to get around the limit, right? And then you get, okay, Access is not good enough. And I think the same principles apply to teaching somebody who's brand new. It's like, okay, I'm going to give you a set of data, and can you just use Excel? Excel's kind of a power tool, so granted, but like it's like, tell me a story with the data. And a lot of what we do is we have mentorships. And so some of our senior people will mentor the younger people. They may not be younger, but like younger in the data space is what I would say. So it's kind of a train person. So I'm not training them. A lot of the people on the line are training them, but a lot of those people learned that way. And so they kind of develop a queue. So if it's helpful if you have a team. If not, then a lot of times it's like, just tell me a story with a set of data, and you give them a set of data and kind of coach them along the way. It's a coach mentality, I think. It's like basketball. Do
you kind of then also work with them to figure out how to sort of almost inject that now knowledge into outcomes? Because, you know, we always talk about and I think Steve McMillan spoke this morning about the idea of the signal and how you push signals into business process. Do you work with them to kind of take that last mile about, you know,
like what would you do with the data, like turn it into action? Yeah, I mean, we do. So I think that goes back to, you know, we were doing this on the fly, and we said, come on, somebody has to invent this. Because, you know, I'm smart, and a lot of our team is smart, but there's so many smart people. So then I was like, who's created a data storyteller process? And I'm like, wow, there's like 400 of them out there. I don't know why I didn't ask this question sooner, right? And so then we took one, and it's like, oh, there's a consultant that will sell you one for $50. And then we adapted it to our style.
Okay.
And a lot of it is just standing on the backs of, back to your point, of giants and figuring out what works for you. So we took a $50 process that was in PowerPoint and adapted it to our style, and that helps with the outcomes to tie it back to your question. So part of the data story process is, where's a question, then you get an answer, and what are you going to do with that answer? And if you don't tie that last piece together, kind of like, well, why did you do that work? And the answer is, I don't know. And that's not a good answer for somebody who's just starting out. It's like, you did that analysis on blood so people wouldn't get a liquid transplant. They wouldn't get a liquid transplant so they didn't have bad outcome. They didn't have bad outcomes, so they went home to their families. Ultimately, the organization saved money, and a unit of blood is now available for somebody that's really sick. So you have to, I mean, it sounds complicated, but you got to tie it back that way when you're thinking about what you're doing, healthcare or not. I mean, every domain has their own story to tell, I guess.
Yeah, great. Is there any questions from the audience? I'll take one over here, and then I've got one over here as well.
Hi, I was curious about what you did with your data. Did you have to normalize a bunch of it?
Yeah, so I skipped over lots of stuff, of course, and that's a great question. Generally, we get raw data in, and we do a bunch of normalizations. Some to industry standards, and we're fortunate enough to have codes in healthcare. It makes it a lot easier. But then some has no standards, and so like a good example of that is what hospitals and health systems charge everybody. Have you ever seen a bill? It's kind of funky. It's got weird charges. So we normalize that so people can benchmark. Now, that is not a standard that exists in the industry, so we created one. So it's either industry standards, or if there isn't one, we'll bridge the gap and create it. And we do normalize a bunch of stuff and have a bunch of data quality tools and algorithms that look at the data quality and all that stuff. That's just a prerequisite, and sorry I skipped that step. That's required for us to do most of this stuff, because the first thing the doctors would tell us, well, of course my patients are sicker. Of course this doesn't apply to me. Of course that blood was the right kind of blood. And that's true in many cases if we hadn't normalized it. So that's like the 101 we have to normalize in what we're doing. We're constantly on an evolution around that, though, because the minute we normalize something, somebody will tell us it's not good enough, and there's some particulars, and something is goofy that we didn't account for. So we're always on a journey with that. No.
So if we can play the question back.
Yeah, so the question was, how do you prioritize? So we were fortunate enough that it's not like I came in, parachuted in my organization and solved all the problems. I'd like to think I'm that smart, but I'm not. We've been on a 20-year journey. So luckily, some of this has been prioritized ahead of time. What we prioritized a lot was getting our data ready on the glass, which is where it wasn't. So we had an opposite approach. We had a lot of normalization, but we weren't always getting it consumed in different ways. So that's kind of what we prioritized first. But if we have a tiebreaker, we have a product management process. And it's similar to a lot of organizations. We say, how much money can we make? How much good can we do? How much happier are our customers going to be if we pick this thing up and normalize it? And I would say it's rational part of the time. I would still say, like any organization, it's not 100% rational. There's pet projects, and you're like, but that would make more money and do more good. And you're like, but so-and-so thinks it's the right thing, and he's the CEO. So, it's semi-rational, I would say. It's about as close as we can get and still be a human-led organization, right? Good question.
Question down the front.
Can you explain more on that SQL library? Can you double click on that? And
Yeah.
what are the LLM models you used in that?
Yeah, great. So what we found is a lot of our analysts in our healthcare organizations that, first of all, it was great because we gave them a SQL tool. Right? You give them a SQL tool, you get to what? Capture the SQL. So that's the first trick, right? So we captured all the SQL. And this might apply to other organizations, hopefully, that are doing self-service analytics and stuff. You can control the logs, right? So we started there, but then we started to think the same data storytelling process I talked about before. We broke it apart, and a lot of our production reports would have question, tell me the length of stay opportunity by hospital for a health system. There's an answer. There's an answer in the form of a visual thing, right? There's an answer for it in a Tableau that writes terrible SQL, not the besmirched Tableau, but if you look at the SQL, it's not that good. So we rewrote the SQL that was in Tableau, and that was our first start of our library. So we built up the question and answer format for the same thing. We were fortunate in that. We really lucked out because now that's what LLMs need, right? They need, they call it something different. I just call it question and answer. They need the labels. Labels is what they call it. They make up new words just to throw us, right? And so that's what we started with was like, and then we used that for our training program. Back to the, how do you teach somebody that doesn't know SQL? We use the same dog food for our training program when we have a new hire or a new hire technically in our member organization is going to use our product, right? Or our data is just kind of keep cycling through the library. Yep.
Any other questions?
After lunch, did I lull you guys to sleep?
Well, thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you.
I really appreciate the effort here. So we'll give Tim a round of applause. Thank you.